Hi, everybody. John Haldi here, and I'm excited to have David Cooper with me. David, welcome.
Thanks, John. Good to see you again.
So we're here today because we gave a presentation in Dallas a couple weeks ago at the Linehaul Summit, and a number of people who were unable to attend our session asked us if we could record it because they were busy at other sessions because there were multiple concurrent sessions. So if you were there and you've seen it, this is going to be a repeat. If you were there and you didn't see it, here it is. And if you weren't even in Dallas, here it is. David, we don't have a room, so let's try to keep it moving because we don't have Q&A coming.
Perfect.
Let's try to recreate what we did there because I think some folks got some value out of it. With your permission, I'm going to share my screen so we have the PowerPoint up. So our title was "The Tide Has Gone Out, Are You Swimming Naked?" And that is a little bit of an homage, if you recall, to Warren Buffett, who once famously said, when the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked, meaning when things are good, everybody does great. Nobody really has to pay attention to details. But when things get rocky, all of a sudden you find out who's not been running a good business, right?
Correct.
And you were the one who alerted me to the fact that we had crazy boom time in COVID. And then we had this post-COVID crash probably back in October. Was that fair?
Yeah, I would say that's right. We were really strong from 19, really, a little bit pre-COVID, but it's like peak 19 hit and then it never stopped all the way through until probably October, November of this last year.
Yeah. And people who had unassigned runs through COVID and had never lived through a non-COVID period finally found out what unassigned meant. And we even saw assigned runs not getting sent out on their assignments. And so for me, I've spoken to a lot of folks about how more than ever, it's critical to be on top of your numbers and manage your business to run it optimally. Because, you know, when the cash is flowing, okay, you're sloshing around and maybe you're not paying attention, but you're still making money at the end of the month. But now when things are tight, you can find out that, boy, and you're not really running a good operation and you're not making any money or you're losing money. And some of it might be your own fault, right?
Correct. Yeah, a lot of guys really through the boom time and through the growth may have overextended themselves a little bit. And then when the freight drops back, they found themselves with too many tractors or too many drivers or, too much of this or that. So it's really to pay attention to the numbers and know that you're running efficiently no matter how much freight is flowing your way.
And this is going to sound really dry, but we're going to get into good stuff in a little bit. But the crux of the problem, I think, is that when people get their reports out of QuickBooks or Zoho or whatever they're using for accounting, they're organized to the benefit of your tax prep person, but they don't provide any useful information to the owner. And that's a real mistake because your financial numbers should be really useful to you. They should be as useful as a dashboard in a truck to a driver, right? They should be giving you real-time information and letting you know that the engine's overheating, your RPMs are running too high, you're speeding, you're going too slow, those kinds of things. And literally, I think the comment that you made or I made at the show is not getting that information out of your P&L is like driving a truck and covering up the dashboard. So let me give you an example of what we oftentimes see when somebody shares their P&L. And if the person who gave us this is on the video watching, I apologize, we're not going to identify you. And I think it's great that all the information's getting into an accounting package. But when I look at this, it's just not organized well. And it's a great start, but it's not where it needs to be, right?
Yeah, it's really hard to get any kind of useful information to make any decisions about your business from what you're looking at here. It's good to see that a contractor is actually putting the time in to create a P&L, because I've seen and worked with a lot of contractors who don't have anything. They don't have a P&L at all to start with. But as we'll go forward and see, it's putting your P&L and placing it in order that makes sense to you and makes sense to your business can really help you create efficiencies and really increase profits.
Yeah. And to me, looking at a flat P&L like this, and even though it's got some subtotals, you can't tell, but like there's fuel above the section that says fuel, there's fuel down below, it's all kind of thrown around. To me, it's like the difference between when the kid's party clown takes a flat balloon, that's what we got here, and then all of a sudden he makes it into a puppy. and now it's something interesting. Well, we got a flat balloon here, and I think we can make it into a puppy. And we threw in a quick slide because this is a great story. When I was a little kid, my mom had a pillow on our sofa in the living room that had this embroidered on it. I always thought that was so funny as a kid, and who would ever think like that? Well, I got to tell you, there's some TSPs who think like this, and that terrifies me, right? They just think, well, how much money's there at the end of the week? And as we all know, that in a simple example, one truck operating great, making payments, taking the money out, and then 4 years later, it's time to buy a new truck, and they haven't saved up or set aside reserves for a new piece of equipment or a rainy day or whatever it is. So I just wanted to throw this in because it speaks to sort of the extreme wrong way to manage your finances. David, you and I, with the help of folks like Becky Doctor at Linehaul Central, I believe Bob Aris contributed to this, and some other really smart folks, we've been thinking about P&L and what's the best way to use it, right?
Correct.
And we're going to dig into all the little pieces here, so don't try to squint your eyes. But at a high level, what this is it's bucketed your operating info into one revenue bucket that's a little different than you might expect, and then 4 or 3 expenses, right? You've got equipment, you've got drivers, and you've got management. Those are the 3 big buckets of expenses. And you might say, where's fuel? Well, it's up in that revenue piece, which we'll show you. And the reason we're bucketing it like this is because those 3 buckets, we know what the right ratios should be. And that's the number that you'd want to see on a dashboard. That's the number you want to have your accounting system spit out to you, whether you do weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annual info, to understand whether or not you're in a happy place, right? So again, it's just like the one we saw, but we literally just rearranged it in QuickBooks, which took us about 15 minutes. All the data is still in there, right? But now we can quickly at a glance make sense of it, which is the idea of a dashboard. And we didn't mention this on the previous slide, but I put it up on the text. The owner of that accounting thing, the one we said wasn't so great, he actually takes that data and every week puts it into a spreadsheet that is shaped in a way that makes sense to him. And my comment was, why are you wasting your time doing that? Just have the accounting software do that. It'll do it if you make it into the balloon animal you want, right? David, you and your brother, I think, run a good business. Do you guys organize your stuff this way, or do you need to come clean and admit it's not the way it should be?
No, this is actually exactly how we organize things. We've adopted EOS over the last few months, really started at the beginning of the year. And with that, you have a company scorecard. Our company scorecards involve revenue. They involve fuel, driver expense, truck expense. We do throw a maintenance expense, but we also cover a management expense on there. Those are our largest expenses. It's what we're looking at every single week. Do we get it in a full P&L format weekly? No, we do that monthly. But those are the expense categories that we look at on a weekly basis.
When you started in this business, were you doing that day one, or did that evolve?
That was all an evolution. We got into it. We got in during the boom. And at times I would say we definitely admit we probably were swimming naked, but there was enough water that it didn't really matter. Over the probably the first 3 years of our business, is where we really started evolving and looking at the bottom line. We were always just chasing a top line dollar. Luckily for us, Jonathan comes from a strong banking background. My partner, he always understand the financials and was, making sure that we were doing things the right way. But we weren't focused on these small numbers. We were focused on the top dollar because we knew the revenue was there to create the profits we needed. Since freight has declined, and really since we got into some other businesses outside of FedEx, is really when we started looking at all of the little pennies to see where we could really push the profits to the max.
Quick aside question. In the evolution, was the barrier to figuring out how to get where you are today from where you were then, was the barrier more of you not knowing what the numbers were that you needed to watch, or was it just the mechanics of figuring out how to use the accounting system to do that?
I would say it was definitely not knowing exactly which numbers to watch. We would find ourselves that a big one that hit us in a truck expense was mud flaps. I openly admitted now in this presentation that we spent over $17,000 in one calendar year on mud flaps because it was a line item that got hidden and it just got thrown to the wayside. It wasn't even in the maintenance expense. And we figured out we were doing equipment wrong and we were charging it as parts instead of maintenance. And it didn't get caught on our weekly, monthly reviews. We caught it on an annual review at the end of the year. Yeah. Bad year for mud flaps. So it took some time. It took figuring out how to group things, how to categorize, how to make sure that all expenses were going into the right bucket in the software to make it to where it could happen efficiently and not having to have somebody go through your numbers with a fine tooth comb every single time to make sure you're on track.
But will it take someone, if we sort of give them the template here, 2 years to get there, or can they do this sitting down with their accountant in a month or two?
Well, that's kind of everything we're trying to do. I've been saying for a long time, I try to teach people what I did wrong in 3 years in a 3-month period so they don't make the same mistakes. So yes, we'll hand this out. We're putting it out in front of people now. But really having a conversation and knowing what all small expenses go into each one of these larger buckets still is really crucial to making sure that your business is where you want it to be.
Gotcha. So this crazy, hard to read, large spreadsheet, if you flatten the groups, the buckets, this is what it starts to look like. This is the high level thing where the top bucket numbers are, right? So the odd thing about the way we organize it is we actually break out trip revenue and total fuel revenue. And that adds up to gross revenue, which is what you see on the settlement statement, right?
Correct.
And in a few minutes, we'll talk about that total fuel revenue because it might not be what you think it is. But then we treat fuel expense as a cost of goods sold. And I'm sure that there are CPAs on there who are scratching their heads. And I'm not a CPA. Maybe that's not the way to do it. But in our mind, that is the way to do it because it breaks out the weird way that FedEx reimburses for fuel and charges for fuel. And the fuel kind of comes in and goes out right at the same time in the settlement. And you get down towards a net settlement. And I got to double check, but I'm pretty sure that the gross profit is equal to the net settlement payment, right?
Correct. It's really close.
It's really close because if you end up with like base plate charges or other adjustments like that, those go down below where they should go, but it's really close to your point, right? It's not to the penny, but some weeks it might be if you don't have those adjustments.
Correct.
Operating expenses, like we talked about, drivers, equipment, and management. Those are the 3 buckets. Now, somebody's, I think, raised their hand in the presentation and asked this. So I got to admit, there's a fuzziness to this. Okay. What happens if you have a manager who has a CDL and drives 1 or 2 days a week? Is that person's pay a driver expense? Is it a management expense? It's really the way you want to do it. And you just need to know how you're accounting it. Maybe you want to split the hairs finally and say some weeks it's for that, or it's always management, or it's in drivers. But you just need to know when these things bleed across lines, how you're doing it so you can interpret your own numbers, right?
Yep. And from my experience, I would say decide early how you're going to categorize those expenses, how you're going to split expenses amongst groups, and stay consistent throughout your entire time doing business.
Right. Because if we tell you that 53% should be your ratio, that's the average, the middle of the bell curve, well, there's a big tail. Yours could be higher, yours could be lower. Maybe it's higher or lower because you're not managing it well, but maybe it's higher or lower because your business is different from most, right? But the important thing is once you get a handle on what your numbers should be, if you're consistent and you know that 55% makes sense for drivers for your business, these numbers get really useful because if you see in a given week or a given month afterwards that it's gone to 58%, you should be investigating that right away. It's a time series data thing, and trends that go against you, you should be concerned about, right? Now, below operating, then you have non-operating. And look, I would never, ever encourage anyone to do tax evasion, but tax avoidance, I think, is a patriotic duty. The government doesn't need extra money. They're not the best charity, right? So if it's legitimate business expenses like meals for, strategic planning meetings, or if you're ordering pizzas for the management team to have dinner, or cell phones or trips that are business related, all that goes in there. But you want to have a clear picture of what your actual operating business is, and not let the fact that, I decided a company car made sense, right? And my accountant said I could do it. Don't let that mess with your numbers. Understand what your business is actually producing, and move all of that on the edge stuff that's for tax benefit purposes, that's not core business related, down below the line, so you get a clear picture from your NOI, right? So let's talk about each of the buckets, shall we?
Great. Yeah, let's go to it.
Okay, fuel. This is the one where people's heads sometimes hurt. So let's spend a little time here, right? We're going to do a separate video to talk about the very weird way that FedEx does fuel, and the non-CPA way that we approach this, right? The crux of the issue that's always bothered me is when I look at someone's settlement and it says that they spent $25,000 on fuel, and you add up all the money that was in the fuel supplement, it says they got paid $17,000. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with that? How do I know whether that's good or bad? Right. David, you and I did this research, and folks like Flint Holbrook and other folks, I think Pat McKay contributed, Tyler Tatum contributed. We reverse engineered Schedule C to understand what's going on and looking at the settlements. The fuel supplement is designed to pay you for the fuel above $1.25 a gallon, right? Apparently, it is absolutely standard and normal that it's always been expected that trucking companies would pay for the first $1.25 per gallon of fuel. You go all over the trucking industry where you see rates that are paid, it's baked in, and then that fuel, typically it's $1.25. Some might be slightly different, but that's the ballpark. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Yeah, that's what we see both in and out of FedEx.
Okay, great. That's the way it's always been done. We don't think that's the way it's useful to you for measuring your profitability. So I've always felt that fuel is one of those things that an AO can pay attention to and dramatically change their bottom line. And certainly with the REL fuel card and the subsequent change from FedEx, where you can get fuel at cost plus zero, it's a lever that if you don't pay attention to, it's at your peril, right? So we did the math, and we figured out that based on Schedule C, they're baking in 19.5 cents per mile in the base of EMR rate for fuel. Now, I know from an accounting tax treatment, there may be a different way to look at this, but if you want to understand your fuel P&L, what you find out is when you start looking at it that way, if you take the amount you spent, and let's pretend it was $25,000, and you take 19.5 cents a mile, plus the 17,000 I said a fuel supplement, what you find is for a healthy business, your revenue for fuel is hopefully at or above what you spent in fuel, right? So there's a sub P&L that every TSP should be watching. We call it the fuel P&L, and organizing it this way gives you a much better picture of what's going on. So if you look at this example, right, David, base fuel reimbursement, that's what we do. The 19.5 cents times the miles was that amount. Fuel supplement was that amount. This was for a much larger period. Of course, nobody's doing this per week. And the fuel expense was less. So the very bottom line, the gross profit, you can see that the fuel P&L added 2.7% to their bottom line.
And I think if we can jump back just a hair, one of the reasons that I started doing fuel, and I think we all started doing fuel this way, is my company. I ran the same amount of miles from 21 to 22 and now into 23 each week, and really started in 20. So from 20 to 21, my gross revenue went up about 17%. And from 21 to 22, my gross revenue went up about 24%. But my gross profit stayed exactly the same because I was running the same amount of miles. And so when you're looking at businesses, evaluating businesses, taking fuel out of the equation, out of the money, really gives you a standardized year to year comparison of how a business is doing.
Right, because when we get to the expense categories and you say, okay, I'm spending X dollars per month on equipment and drivers and management, if you're comparing that to your gross revenue as the denominator of a ratio, well, if gross revenue is going up or down based on fuel price alone, and your business is exactly the same, all of a sudden your percentages are changing. And how do you make sense of that? Because, hey, during this period, my drivers were 52%. Fuel goes up, drivers is the same cost, but your gross revenue goes up. If you use gross revenue in the ratio, well, you're looking and you're popping the champagne because a quarter later, drivers is only 48% of your gross revenue. Hey, I'm doing great, right? Well, you're paying your drivers the exact same amount. Nothing changed, except you're not looking at the right number. So it becomes useless. Like it would almost be like if your miles per hour on a truck dashboard was relative to wind speed, right? In a headwind, oh, look how fast I'm going. I'm doing 90 miles an hour. With a tailwind, I'm doing 40. But, you know, you're actually doing 72. You're violating the governor rules and the cop pulls you over. Like, but wind speed said I was great. Like, well, that's too bad. You're looking at the wrong number, right?
That's a great analogy.
When you don't pay attention to fuel, David, would you mind walking us through this example of someone who's got a problem and how it cascades down into their P&L?
Yeah, it really just starts at not paying attention to the fuel number. So you can see we're just a small percentage, and we may want to pan back to the previous screen, but a 5% change in your gross profit on your fuel. I think it went from 98 to 102.7 on your gross profit to 98%. It impacts the bottom line in a bigger way. So paying attention to fuel, your fuel purchases, REL fuel card, he's mentioned it several times. Everybody's mentioned it several times. REL fuel card changed the game. It made it to where we can buy fuel at cost almost anywhere across the country. There's very few routes you will take where you won't pass a station where you can buy with the REL fuel card at cost. The other thing is paying attention to fuel economy on your trucks. That's big. As John mentioned, FedEx reimburses at a 6.41 miles per gallon ratio. If you're doing below 6.41, you are losing money on fuel week in, week out. Making sure that your truck is up to date. FedEx did a lot of good things with bringing new safety technology, but it also made the truck fleet a whole lot newer on our side. It made the truck fleet more fuel efficient. FedEx acknowledges that too. Be on the lookout as contracts change. It happens almost every year where the fuel reimbursement changes and they change the miles per gallon. So if you're not continuously improving the fuel economy of your fleet, you will eventually fall behind on your fuel income.
Yes, and they did not change it last year. If I'm a betting man, I would be putting money on change this year, and it ain't going in your favor, right?
Yeah.
Very few things in the TSP world are black and white. There's always different ways to do things. I personally think that fuel is very black and white. If you're not taking advantage of all the opportunities to get cost plus zero fuel through either the T-Check card from FedEx, but even better, the REL card, which layers on the TA Petros, a year ago, you wanted cost plus zero. For the most part, you had to go on the yard with 87, 89 places to get fuel. But today with the REL fuel card, there's over 1,000 of them. And all the TA Petros, Pilot and Flying J's, they give your drivers points. So a lot of the arguments why you had to allow drivers to go to Love's, for example, I do all my Christmas shopping off Love's catalog. Well, okay, it's not Love's. I have a feeling at some point they're going to come back to the table and join the party. But for now, I think you need to be telling your drivers, you fill up at FedEx, you fill up at Pilot, Flying J, TA, or Petro, or you expect a call from me when I get the settlement, and you better have a damn good reason why you weren't going there.
That's how we operate.
If you're running subpar fuel efficient trucks, just understand you're giving money to FedEx by buying more fuel than you have to. And there's a lot better charities than a Fortune 100 company. I'm not disparaging FedEx. I'm just saying they don't need charity from you. It should work the other way. And if you're buying at retail outside of the places you can get cost plus zero, you're giving the massive fuel companies charity. And again, there's better places to help people. So let's shift gears and talk about drivers. A shortcoming in our software today, we don't have numbers related to benefits and taxes and workers' comp. We're working towards that so that we can give you a complete picture, but your accounting system does, right? So when you think about driver expenses, all of that stuff should go in that bucket, right? this is indicative. You might have 10 more categories of driver expenses. I don't know what you spend on your drivers, but it should all be in a bucket, and you should be looking at that and wondering how much total of the revenue that I'm coming in is going to my drivers.
Yeah. And this is such an important tool that I've used in numerous ways with our company. I show this to my drivers on a regular basis. If somebody asks us for a raise, or they say, hey, this contractor XYZ is paying 85 cents a mile for teams, you are only at 76. We come back to them and say, we show them this exact graph. And we say, all right, well, we're offering you the per diem. We offer you premium health insurance, and we take care of a larger percentage of that health insurance than most. We give you the uniforms. We spend the money on the meal. Like, we show them all of this, and we show them their full cost and really their full benefits package as it is as a driver. And I've gone as far as showing drivers our entire P&L and say, look, we need to make this percentage to be profitable as a company and to be, to sustain us as a company. This is all I can afford to pay you. I've had that speech with drivers. I think this can be a fantastic tool to use in your recruitment, to use in your retention, to use in a lot of ways for your company.
Yeah, because I think without that kind of communication, you run the risk of drivers thinking, oh, those owners are sitting there like fat cats and just keeping everything. And if they don't understand how tight the business is and the amount of capital that's involved and why it's so hard to be a TSP, you run the risk of actually being generous to them and them griping and thinking you're being cheap. 57% in our example. Baseline, ballpark, that what you expect to see?
I'd say it's a little high. I think this contractor, probably the employee uniform, we probably picked a bad number on this, could be wrong on that side. Seems a little bit high for this size of entity to have $85,000. And I think that's probably where our off is. So.
That's a mislabel. I suspect that's workers' comp. And
yeah, those are probably switched there.
Okay.
But no, 57%. We try to run total all-in costs somewhere around 55 with teams, and a little bit lower with the solo drivers. So I do say that this is a little bit on the high side. Okay. It's not terribly off, but for what we like to see when looking at companies, it is on the upper end.
Everybody's mileage is going to vary, right? There's a gray area too. So for example, what's not here is safety training. Is that a management expense or is that a driver expense? Goes back to what we talked about. Decide and make it consistent. And then you can look for trends week to week, month to month. So, but I actually think, David, that you've got a biased view. You talk to some of the more elite contractors. You guys are very successful. I think this number is actually in the ballpark. I think this is middle of the bell curve in the TSP community. And I think what I've seen is sometimes you'll find AOs who've had success skimping on benefits, but loading up on the CPM, right? And other folks trim the CPM and load up on benefits. So those are two different places where the individual numbers is really personality based in terms of how you want to recruit and retain drivers, right? And then there's in the middle of the road there. But these are the kinds of things that you need to look at, and you need to be able to say, what is workers' comp? Obviously here it's wrong. It's 0.1. It's probably closer to 3.5%. But what are these individual numbers related, and have a sense for where they should be historically versus where they are now, right? And let's look at someone who's definitely gone off the deep end. Here, the total drivers is up at 66%. So when you move from there, what happens is it cascades, right? It cascades down into your NOI and into your final net income. And a lot of people think, well, I know I'm spending too much on drivers, I'll make it up somewhere else. Well, where? You're going to have fewer trucks, fewer managers. So I would tell someone who's thinking that way, it's okay, I can make it up somewhere else. Well, really the two most likely places you're going to make it up is in working harder and not having staff, or in taking less out of the business. That's what you're calling making it up. 52% on salaries and wages. Let me go back here, right? You might say, well, that's not crazy. Okay. Well, it is, because in our database, we've actually got people living here. It's not a small number of people who are over near 52. There's that big bar here. That was for the week of June 2. So don't think that that's a complete outlier. There's a whole bunch of people doing that. And I worry about the folks there when I look at this chart for our payroll numbers. I worry about them because they're probably not taking money out of their business, or they're skimping on things they can't afford to skimp on. Right. So,
Yeah. And this is a number that we've looked at over the years and paid close attention to. And we've used it during our hiring, right? When there are times when freight's booming, especially when the spot rates outside of FedEx go up, it is harder to get drivers. That is the time where we say you can get away with swimming naked, though, because there is so much freight. A lot of guys will skimp by with paying a little bit more. But then as freight slows down, especially if you're paying minimums and that kind of stuff, that's where these numbers can really creep up. But also as freight slows down, it's a good time to put ads back out and maybe try to lower your cost of employee or of your employees. You don't want to get rid of your best guys, but if you have problem childs that you're paying top dollar because they were the only guy you could find when freight was booming, it's the time to replace them now. It's time to look at these numbers and see if you can save a couple percentage points.
Yeah. And to your point, during boom times, where you can hide a lot of problems is that you have a solo truck that might normally do 2,500 miles a week, but there's so much excess freight that you're actually getting 3,300 miles out of it. That hides a lot of sins. Right. So I'm with you 100% on that one. And it worries me because we really do genuinely want every TSP to be successful. And these numbers, when we get them organized, this is where it jumps out. And driver pay is a big one. The other big one where we find the problems, of course, is in equipment. Similar to drivers, we want to bucket all of the truck expenses in here. This is where we bucket things. And trucks is a weird one, because the accounting can go different ways depending on whether you're leasing or buying, correct?
Yeah, whether the numbers are in the operating expense or below that line, that can change a lot with leasing and purchasing.
Let's elaborate on that, because when you say below that line, you mean below the operating income line, right?
Correct.
So I'm going to say something that's going to make every CPA that watches this cringe. But when you buy trucks, the standard rule is that you're driving towards this EBITDA number. So earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Okay. In order to make a P&L useful to an owner, I think you have to bring book depreciation on purchased trucks up into the operating expense, because depreciation is a very real number. Do you agree or disagree?
I think that is a number that should be kept watch on by owners. To say it goes above the line, I think I would be with the CPAs who are cringing.
Okay.
It would make hard for me to make sense of it. But it comes down to replacement costs is where I believe you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
If you're not paying attention to what it takes to get a truck off the ground, I tell people on a daily basis that you need to have $25,000 cash in the bank if you want to get a truck. You need to have another probably 20,000 for the first 6 months if you're starting a new route with that tractor. If people aren't paying attention to the depreciation and they're just taking all that money out and not leaving a rainy day fund or a replacement fund in there for tractors, that's where people get caught swimming naked when it's time to replace equipment.
Yeah, the thing that frustrates me from getting a true picture is if you buy a truck today for 200 grand and 4 years from now, you're going to sell it for 60 grand, and you basically used up 140 grand of value out of that truck. But because of tax fun, you get to depreciate a ton of this stuff. I just think you need to, whether it's above the line or below the line, when you look at these numbers, you have to conceptually bring it above and recognize that you're eating up the value of that truck year by year, and you ignore it at your peril. Couple things happen. You get walloped with it. Oh my God, I got to replace trucks, right? And then you also get blindsided because you think that your ratio on expenses for the truck is much better than it actually is, because you're not baking that into the cake for the math. And I know why you want to keep it below the line, because your brother's a banker and you've got to present reports to lenders and all those kinds of things. But from an operating standpoint, I would love to see it up there for purchased trucks, because then you can get to this right out of your accounting system. You don't have to do an add back to figure out the math, right?
Mm-hmm. From a pure operating standpoint, I do see the point you're making. I can see where it would help on a weekly basis having that number up there. Another thing, I think where a lot of guys got away with it. We've seen a truck environment, a used truck environment over the last 2 years that we've never seen before. We've had trucks that I've heard guys that have trucks that are insurance claims that they bought them 2 years ago for 140,000 and they're getting check stroked for 145,000 from the insurance company. It let people get away with a lot of mistakes.
It did, but remember when they got to go replace that truck, guess what they're paying?
They're at 190.
Right. When you talk about accelerated and bonus depreciation and all those wonderful things, it's not a free gift. It's just a timing thing. You get to defer certain things and decide when you want to take those expenses sooner or later to possibly get a free loan on taxes that would have been due now, pay them later. But once you're operating and you got a large fleet, that check is always coming due. I mean, it's just a timing thing. So be honest with your expenses. And look, I've talked to a lot of TSPs. Some of them swear by all new on warranty, get rid of them at 400,000 or 500,000 miles, boom, done, make my life easy, reduce my costs, reduce my time out of service. There are some TSPs, and I don't want to give away competitive secrets here, that are living with just buying trucks that are 400,000 and 500,000 miles. And they figured out how to make that work for their business because they're in a situation where it could work. And their P&Ls blow my mind. They're in a very happy place on equipment expenses, as are people who are doing it differently. So the thing you can't do is just shrug and not pay attention to your bills, not think about, is it time to replace this truck? Is it starting to cause me more headaches? Is it out of service more than it should be? You need to know your numbers for your business, what works for you, because let's jump and look at what happens when truck costs get a little bit out of line, right? Just having too much equipment. Right? David, help us understand what's going on in this picture.
This one here, it seems that the equipment, the breakdowns are what killing you. I think that's a number that people don't pay attention to also is downtime. And there's really no way to categorize that in a P&L, but the loss of revenue from the downtime on this one, it's kind of annotated by the equipment rental cost. But that downtime can kill you from the loss of revenue. It'll impact you more than just on the bottom line. So please keep that in consideration. But this one's showing most likely some older equipment. The repair costs are a little bit higher. It could be that they went through a spell. You see it with certain makes and models to where you hit a certain mileage with the trucks. I've heard of talked to a guy down in Dallas actually, that he bought 8 brand new trucks and he basically deplenished his repair expense. He was running at sub 1 cent a mile, but he bought 8 brand new trucks for 8 dedicated runs that were the exact same mileage at the exact same time. And a year and a half later, he needed all brand new tires all the way around. And he didn't have cash left in the bank to buy the tires.
Ouch.
So using just your expenses and not depending on how you're doing the accounting, you may want to take into consideration the rainy day funds to realize the hidden expenses of the trucks that are wearing and tearing that aren't being an expense today because you have to pay for them later. But the repair and maintenance costs can eat you alive. I think a healthy number industry wide that people use for just tractors is about 6 cents per mile. And that is for a fleet that has, multiple years of age. If you're running all brand new equipment and your tractor lease or your tractor payments are higher, you have to get that equipment expense lower, or the repair and maintenance expense lower. At the bottom line of it, comes down to you have to keep track of that total truck expense and keep it somewhere in this low 20 range.
Agreed. I see so many games played in the trucking side, in the truck bucket, where people are basically, it's like me when I get out of the shower and I stand in front of the mirror and I say, you don't need to lose weight. It's that kind of lying to yourself, right? This is where people tell themselves lies the most. And it's dangerous because we all know that the goal is to take money out of this business and build wealth and that kind of stuff. And if you're lying to yourself with these numbers, well, who's benefiting at the end of the day, right? So let's talk about management. And I think we're okay on time right now, but maybe we're running long. I apologize if that's the case. Management often feels like trying to nail Jello to a tree when we talk to people about this, right? I'm going to give you the first big sin that we see. You have an AO. She's been working in the business for 8 years. Her husband works in the business. Combined, they probably each work 80 hours a week, and they haven't taken a vacation in 4 years. right? And there's nothing in their P&L for their pay. Even if it's not actual pay, there's nothing to indicate the fact that they're doing the work of 4 people.
Yep. We see that often. People don't value their own time, and not even that they don't value their own time, they don't put a dollar figure on their own time, and they don't show that on a P&L. It is where people hide their mistakes a lot.
And again, it comes back to me in the mirror, and I don't need to lose weight. Like, it just, you're lying to yourself, and that doesn't do you or your business any good. And oftentimes people do it because they say, well, at least this way I'm taking 200 grand a year out of my business. Well, if you went out and both got jobs and you could each make 150 grand because you know how to run a business, wouldn't it be better to sell this business and go work for someone else? Right? And have a sane lifestyle and 2 weeks of vacation. Like, I don't understand the games people play. We talked to someone, not naming names, who has a fantastic large business, and their management percentage was what, like a 3%? Because they were covering up some of the payroll costs. We suggested, because they were both redlining themselves, that they should look to hire 1 or 2 people in their business. And they said, I can't possibly afford that. And I was like, what are you talking about? You're taking a huge sum of money out of your business. What do you mean you can't afford that? Like, 2 people is going to put a dent of like 15% in your net take home. Why wouldn't you hire them and actually have a chance to breathe? Like, one of you's working during the day, the other's working at night. Like what kind of lifestyle is that? And they're just racing on the treadmill as fast as they can, I guess, to cash out. But this is where you really find out quickly how they're running the business and whether they're personally redlining themselves. I think there's a safety issue there too, safety for the business. If you're a classic TSP and there's not enough hours in the day, I'll go ahead and tell you there's 2 things you're not spending enough time on. Number 1, looking for more opportunities from FedEx. And number 2, managing safety. And from a risk management standpoint, if you're the business owner and you're not paying attention to the top line and the biggest risk where you could lose everything because of safety issues, that's not a good place to be health-wise, right?
Yep. And unfortunately, we hear it all the time where guys say, well, I just don't have time for that. And it's the safeties would get pushed to the backside, or the business side gets pushed to the backside because they're worried about dispatches, or worried about truck repairs, or this or that or the other. There's vendors for that space. There's people for that space. Find someone to do it to where you can spend your time as a business owner making your business better, not keeping it afloat, but actually improving your business.
There's an old adage, and it took me a long time to internalize it, but there's a difference between working in your business and working on your business. And if you're working in your business 80 to 100 hours a week, there ain't no time left to work on your business. It ain't going to get any better. And the classic comeback is, well, if I could make a little bit more, then I could afford to hire that person. Here's the conundrum. You ain't going to make a little bit more if you're redlining, so you're never going to hire that person. Growing a business requires investment, and sometimes that means taking the plunge and hiring that person so that then you can go after making a little more, right? So time-wise, I want to keep us on the clock here because we've run longer than I thought we would, kind of like we did in Dallas. So these are some of the management issues. Non-operating expenses, they're real, but sometimes they're not. And if the IRS is watching, I know you know this, so I'm not going to tread on anything. You and your spouse go to dinner. You have a nice dinner together, and you actually talk about work. Well, guess what? That's deductible at 50%, maybe even 100 if it was necessary to get the work done. Take advantage of every legal means to reduce your tax bill, right? Account for it, but don't let that cloud the numbers up above that tells you about the health of the core business, right? Cars, things like that, travel. Understand whether it's really core business and belongs up above in management or belongs down below, because you're kind of dancing on the line there, right? Be honest with yourself with your accounting. It's all accounted for. It's all legitimate. I'm never, ever going to encourage anyone to try to lie on their tax returns. But so wrapping up, COVID boom was awesome for most folks, right? I think if I had been a TSP, even I could have made some money in during the COVID boom, right? I recognize I'm not a TSP because what TSPs do operationally and managerial, I don't have the skill set. I'm an analytical guy. I think I'd be a great CFO for a TSP, but I don't know many TSPs who can afford a CFO. But I think in COVID, I could have made money doing this, right? It's not COVID anymore. The last 6 months have proven that. Pay attention to your numbers, right? If your accountant is someone who you speak to once a year and you give them a shoebox full of receipts and printouts from your QuickBooks, you're not doing it right. Your accountant should be a critical part of your team. And if they're just a bookkeeper, then they won't be, but you need to have a CPA that understands transportation and can meet with you maybe quarterly for an hour or two, talk about what you're thinking about, talk about balance sheets, talk about underwriting, talk about forecasts, talk about cash flow. They should be a partner. They should be like an adjunct to your team that you pay a couple hours for periodically to really look at your business and your numbers. And these reports is what they're going to look at. And hopefully they have some industry knowledge to give you some insight that's well worth the money you're going to spend for their time. Fair? Understand that these numbers we're showing you, they are kind of middle of the road bell curve numbers. Your business is going to be different. If you are on the high side for every bucket, you're going to be different in the sense that you're walking bankruptcy, right? If you're on the high side on pay, hopefully you're on the low side on equipment, or you're doing great on fuel, or, high on equipment costs. You got to figure out the balance and make sure it all adds up on the bottom line. But absolutely, you should get consistent, and your accounting system should add a button, give you a report that you can look at real quick. And you should know right away, am I trending in the wrong direction somewhere, or am I trending in the right direction? Do I need to get my managers on the phone and talk about this right now before it gets worse? That's the goal that you want to get to. David, I'm going on, and I haven't given you a chance to break in, and you're the smart guy on the call, so I apologize.
No, I completely agree with you. I think the one key takeaway that I can add to it is just to really stay consistent. We've said that so many times with it, but that is the key to our business. That is how I know in an instant if I have something going wrong or not. If I'm not managing and looking at my numbers the exact same way week after week after week, it takes too long and we may be too far off path to correct it in the best way. So really looking at this, knowing this, having enough time in your schedule to be able to look at this thoroughly is crucial.
Yeah, to David's point, there's a Navy expression, a little rudder far from shore is better than a lot of rudder near the rocks. Like, see what's coming. David's probably going to kill me for doing this, but I'm going to give you a little inside secret for the way we do things with our services business. We have people come to us regularly and their business is a hot mess and they don't know why. They just know that there's no money left over at the end of the day. The first thing we do is we say, give us an Excel dump of your accounting, and we rearrange it into the pretty balloon animal we were talking about. And when we do that, all of the problems tend to jump off the page immediately. So little inside trick, if you're not going to do that, well, you're missing an easy thing to do, because there's some folks who didn't need to come to us because they could have done that if they rearranged their own P&L. It would have been obvious to them, right? As obvious as a bridge is out sign. So David and I are happy to take questions from anybody who has them. We love talking to y'all. Our goal is to help you be more successful. We hope that this was useful to you. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'll have our info and a link below the video and here embedded in the video. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at the various events coming up. Next one is the Linehaul News Regional Conference in Phoenix on October 6th. So if you're watching this and it's before October 6th, see you in Phoenix. David, thank you for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Great chatting with you, John.